stamping friends, welcome back. It's Sandy here. I'm going to share a little watercoloring fun with you today. I am playing with the early Tulip stamp set from Picket Fence. It was from their March release, and I'm also having some more fun with these ARTEZA markers. These are the Real Brush Pens. They've got watercolor paint inside them. Here's the stamp set I'm using. It's Picket Fence again, early Tulips, their March release, and I've got a link on my blog to it. I heat embossed in black onto a piece of Canson watercolor paper, and I'm starting off with a light purple. This is Wisteria. Scribble a little bit on and then blend it around. And you want to do kind of petal by petal until you get really used to the technique, because if you leave the paint on there too long, it gets really hard to move. So I'm going around kind of petal by petal, adding a little bit of the lighter purple. And then I'm going to come back in with the middle color, the eggplant. And I'm just adding a little bit of ink where the artist has added some shadows to the petals and blending it out a little bit with the water pen again and working my way around. And you'll notice that I start to clean my brush off on a piece of paper towel, and all you have to do is flick it across a piece of paper towel and it will get rid of any ink that you have on there. So if you're moving dark color around and you want to go back to light, just flick it on paper towel. So this is the third color, and this is Wisteria. It's got a little bit of pink in it, but I thought it really added a nice highlight. And I'm moving on to the little bulb that's here. I'm going to make this one a little bit darker because of course it hasn't opened yet, but again with the same colors and then just blending out as I go. Adding a little bit of the Wisteria there. So it's really easy to do this. Here you see I'm starting to clean my brush off when I get too much paint, and you'll see when I start adding the blue and the yellow, you really have to keep your brush clean, otherwise you're just going to muddy all the colors up. So you notice here that my purple's not activated. It's because that petal's too wet, and so sometimes if you notice that happening, move on to another petal and color it and just work your way around and let that first petal dry up a little bit. What's happening is the water's getting into the paint and it's diluting it, so it's not coming out as dark as we want it to. And you see me go back and forth. Here I go. I'm going back in and adding that purple. See how much better it worked that time? And pulling it around. And I'm coming up from the bottom because that's where the shadows are. And you see as I get into some lighter colors in a little bit, I actually come down from the top because I don't want to drag the dark color all the way up. And it's a matter of just playing around and seeing what you like. Sometimes you can dilute it out so much you have to add more purple. And you want to leave some white spots. You want to have, some light shining on your tulips and bringing them to life by the depth that you're adding to the color. And that was me taking a little bit of spot off the background because I went over the line. And so what you can do is just clean your brush off really well and then add a little bit of water and just rub it and then soak it up with your piece of paper towel. So here I'm adding a little bit more Wisteria. I kind of saved the third color on a bunch of this and went back because I knew that it was going to be too wet. And so as they start to dry, I come back in with the third color and bring it back in, and see how it just really adds some detail to the flowers. And here I'm flicking it off because I have too much and I want to keep that top spot light. And if I hadn't have done that, it would have been all pink. So on to, I think, the last one, the big guy at the bottom. And I'm getting brave because I'm working faster, so I'm doing a few petals at a time. And as you get used to the technique, you can do that. You'll still find that it moves around. If you find that it's starting to not move around, that means it's dried too much. So back off on how many petals you do at a time. And I know that's wet, so again, I'm going back to this other one on the right-hand side and adding the Wisteria in there. And fixing up a couple of spots that are showing up white. And now it's dried a bit, I can come back in and add the eggplant to this one and blend it out a little bit. I kind of like the detail of that one right there. I wish I hadn't added a whole bunch of darker color to it. But sometimes it's fun just to play around and see how the pens work. You'll find that some of the colors blend a little bit easier than the other ones. I've really noticed that. The darker colors seem to blend a little bit easier. I guess because there's more pigment in it, which that makes sense. So adding my detail in there. This really adds life to it right there. You remind me of parrot tulips as a kid. My mom had the most awesome tulips when I was growing up. They were beautiful oranges and yellows and reds. So here I decide to incorporate a little teal. I think, like, oh, okay, what happens if I add a little bit of blue into this? Will I get some nice depth of field? And I do. And here's where you see I start working from the top down. I want to continue blending, but I don't want that blue up in near the top. So clean your brush off and pull from the top down. And that'll allow you to blend without filling in your entire flower. You spent all that time working around those highlights. It'd be nasty to mess it up now. And when the paint is wet, if you decide that you have too much, wet it and then just put your paper towel over it and it will wick up any of the wet paint and lighten it up for you. But this color is dark, so be careful about how much you add. And I have linked all the colors and everything on my blog post so that you can know exactly which colors that I used. And I have a package of the 48 of the ARTEZA Real Brush Pens. And there's also a 10% off coupon on my page as well, just in case you decide you need to have them. They're pretty cool pens. I quite enjoy them. You can get really artistic with them. So you could also put some pink in here if you wanted it lighter. I wanted deeper shadows. That's why I chose blue, but a lighter pink would be nice as well. And you're going to see in a second that I come in with a little bit of yellow to add some highlights as well. And that's a nice color. But I'm going to dry brush it. Most of these are finished now. They're dry. And so you can come back in with the yellow. And if you don't get it too wet, you can just kind of move it around on top. But if you start messing with it, it's going to blend in with the purple and it's going to turn a nasty brown. So just be careful about how much you flick it around. But I like the life that it adds to it. And the last little guy down here, pick a few spots and just blend it in. Okay, so there's the purples all done. I'm moving to the greens, and for the greens I used parakeet green, light green, seaweed green, and I highlight with lemon yellow and with the teal again. I use the teal exclusively on this entire piece, even in the background you'll see in a minute. So for the leaves, I added 3 colors at a time, but I started blending with the lighter color, and then I was careful about how far I pulled the darker colors in. And now I'm coming back with that teal to add a little bit of the shadowing detail. And again here, you got to be careful about not over mixing, otherwise it's just going to turn into one blobby color. So here's the light green, and then I'm doing the medium green, adding just a few spots, and then a little bit of the dark green down where it's shadowed out in the stamp, and blending it in. Coming back with a little bit of teal, and I'm adding that kind of to the shadows, and then pulling that out too. But be careful not to pull it out over top of your light green, otherwise you're going to lose that depth of field in there. So just zipping around and doing the stems now, starting with the light green, and then I went back in with the seaweed green because they're kind of under the tulips, so they should be a little bit darker, and just quickly blending those two together. Over to these big leaves, again starting with the light green, coloring some of that in, coming back in with the medium green, I think that's parakeet, and then seaweed into the shadows. And you can just do lines, or you can do little, I find that I turn the pen a little bit on its side and it makes a little bit wider streak, and it seems to make it a little bit easier to blend as well because it's covering a larger surface, or because it stays wet longer because there's more ink. Whatever the reason, it seems to work for me, although I do find that I go outside the lines a little bit, bending it over like that. So I'm just using my water pen, blending that in, and now I'm getting rid of a little bit of green that went outside the lines, and adding a little bit of light green back in, my medium green, and then my dark for shadows, starting at the top with the lighter color and blending down to the darker, and then adding a little bit of the teal. And there we go, there's the main part done. And then you can come back in with a little bit of yellow. Again, you can dry brush it in. So I'm just going to go right over top of that paint, which is almost dry. It doesn't take very long for this to dry. And even if it's damp, quite often it will still sit on top. If it just pops right in and blends in with the color. The paint's too wet. You have to wait a few minutes. But it's a nice way to add quick highlights. So for the background, go into these small sections again. I'm using teal, and I'm adding the color where I think the shadow is going to be on the picture, so that if I don't get it pulled out all the way, the shadow will look quite natural. You see right here, it doesn't blend really well, and up in this next spot too. So I'm adding a little bit of yellow again. This is lemon yellow, and blending that in because I want it to have a lighter background. I want my leaves to be a little bit darker than the background is. So just blending these colors together. And this takes a little bit, but just work in the small sections. Adding a little bit of yellow while the teal is still wet so that it blends. If you come back in afterwards, you have to try and activate the teal underneath to get it to blend, and that gets a little bit difficult, especially if you've let it dry for, quite some time. So adding just a little yellow back in. And I'm staying on the right side of that so that the shadow stays underneath of the tulip. And blending it out. Now when you start to blend it out to the white space, you do not want a line. So you see that I really scribble and blend it out until it's really light, and I don't have a line going across it. It's very zigzaggy. And that will help so that you don't have a definition or a definite line outside of your tulips when you go to blend the background. So again, adding a little bit of the yellow, blending that. You see this one doesn't blend very well. Okay, so turning it a bit, I'm going to start working out here and blending this out. It's quite dark. So for the next one, because it's such a big space, I'm actually going to wet it first. So take your water brush, wet it out, then add the teal, and then blend it. You'll see it blends a lot easier because the paper's wet. And it gives me the opportunity to pull it a little bit farther and not have such a dark color. So I'm doing the same thing at the bottom, wetting it first, adding the teal, coming back in and blending it out. So at this point, I'm going to grab a paintbrush and some water because this big white space I want to color in a little bit, and the little tip on the water brush is just not quite going to cut it for me. So I'm adding a pile of water, just making sure that all of this white space that I want to use is wet before I add some color in, and this helps dilute it because you want this really light. I don't want it dark like it is behind my tulips. And keeping it wet, I'm going back in with my paintbrush and blending it out. And because this is watercolor paper, you can really get at this a little bit. This one did eventually peel a little bit, but I worked it pretty hard. And I like those colors in the background. It reminds me of spring. Nice blue sky with a little bit of yellow. And I think it contrasts nicely with the tulips because it's the same colors that we used, but they're just highly diluted. And get right back in there where you've got that blending coming out from between the tulips, and really pull that color out to blend it in. Any lines that you've got. There we go. It's quite wet, but I'm happy with it. So you can wait until it's dry, or if you're very impatient like I am and you like instant gratification, grab your heat tool and give it a good heat. You'll see I've got a little bit of warpage going on there, and it's starting to curl as I dry it. The trick behind this is just flip it over and heat it from the back, and it will flatten your paper out for you. And those little warps that I have going on, as I said, this is a very light, I think this is 80 or 90 pound watercolor paper, so it's very light, and I'm just going to add extra adhesive on the back, and that will flatten it out. So to do my splotches, or my flicking, I'm going to be using the Gansum Tambi gem colors, and I'm just going to add some water to the purple and the gold and get it blended nicely so that I can pick some up. And I think this is a number 2 or a number 4 brush, and I'm just going to flick some of this onto my, apparently I'm practicing first, which is a good idea. Use your scrap paper underneath and practice. Make sure you're getting the size of blobs that you want. I wanted a little bit thicker than what's going on. It was quite diluted at that time. I want to pick up a little bit more paint. And so then I'm going to flick this over the entire card, but mostly on that background that I just finished. And that's why I had to make sure that the background was good and dry. If it isn't, it's just going to blend in with your background and it's going to smear, and you're not going to be very happy with it. So cleaning my brush out, and I'm flipping over to the gold, going to do the same thing. Get that paint worked up really well. Get it a little bit on the thick side. Sorry, my camera's having a little hissy fit there. It's like, what do you want me to focus on? And this gold, I purposely flicked over top of the tulips as well, and it really added some nice highlight because the gold really shows up on the darker color painting. It's really pretty on the tulips and the leaves. And you can also tap it against your finger. I find if you tap it against your finger, you get smaller blobs. So again, impatient me, I'm going to heat set this, and then I'm going to die cut it to fit out on the side of and the front of my card. So I'm going to use my SCOR-BUDDY, and I'm making my card base. Next, I'm going to get my Simon Says Stamp Stitched Rectangle Wafer Dies, and I'm going to use the largest one. It's going to cut out my 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 for me, and it's also going to add a beautiful stitched edge around my art piece. So I'm using some purple tape and lining it up as close as I can against the design on the bottom right hand side there. And I'm going to add a few pieces of tape to it just to hold it in place, and then run it through my Gemini and cut it out. There we go, it's all cut out. We have a beautiful finished piece, and it has a nice cut edge on it, and it looks nice and finished on the card. So add a bunch of adhesive to the back. Here's my secret for getting it on straight. Put your card base up into the top corner of your SCOR-BUDDY, and then use that corner to lay your top piece in. So for the sentiments, there's a whole bunch in this set. So what I did was I laid them all into my MISTI, and I white heat embossed them onto a half sheet of black, so I have a whole selection. And I used a couple of different ones. For this one, I actually went around and cut it out so that it looks like it was die cut. Added a little bit of foam tape to the back and attached it to my card. And so the final embellishments, I'm going to use the Simon Says Flowering Clover Sequins. I just got these. They're brand new, and they're absolutely fabulous. They're iridized light green, light blue, and pinks. All of the colors I just finished using in my tulips. So they coordinate beautifully. And I'm using my Studio Acacia embellishment wand and tray, and this thing is just awesome. Get your glue going, and then look how easily it picks up these sequins and then pops them back down for me. Awesome tool. And I have that linked on my blog for you, as well as the little tray. So there you go. Here's the two finished cards. The one on the left was the one I did first. The one on the right is the one I did in this video. You'll notice it's a little bit lighter, and I kind of like that. And all of the items that I used in today's project I have listed underneath the video in the comments. There's also a link over to my blog where you can choose from a variety of different stores to order your supplies from. And if you enjoyed today's technique, please give me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. Until next time, toodles.